on page 5 of the October 23rd document, and it shows the updated quota. Is that the working group recommendation for yellow eel?
Yes.
Okay. The reason I asked, there was discussion earlier during your presentation using the filters and not disadvantaging too much, not advantaging too much, that type of an approach. But some of these updated quotas are still pretty harsh in terms of a reduction, and notably Virginia's about a 24% reduction. PRFC is about a 52% reduction. I'd like to ask Kate if she could, if it would be all right with the chair, to put up a table. I won't dwell on it very long, but I think it might help if you have that, or if this is opportune time, to give us an idea. There it is, I think.
So, Rob, just a quick question. And obviously this was an item that the work group really struggled with, was trying to find a balance with each state's high periods being somewhat differently, and trying to, account for recent fisheries versus historical fisheries. So when you referenced the reductions that you did, what time frame are you referencing?
I'm referencing 1998 to 2010. In the case of PRFC, the average was 125,803 pounds, and the updated quota is 52,358. For Virginia, the 1998 to 2010 average was 102,070 pounds, and the updated quota is 78,702. I bring those together because when we talked about buyers earlier, and certainly there's central buying within the Bay jurisdiction, so that's why I brought that up for PRFC in Virginia. The table, which is hard for me to even see what's up there, but I have it here, indicates that there are certainly several states, and I'm going to go through them very briefly, that if you compare the working group quota to 1998 to 2010, and there's a reason I'm saying 1998 to 2010, because earlier when I asked the technical committee chair of the basis for the 12%, that was based on 1998 to 2010. So as I look across the states, on the top table, since you probably can't focus in on it, Delaware is a reduction of 45%, PRFC of 58%, Virginia of 23%. Those are all decreases. The increases are Maryland at 43%, and North Carolina 25%, Florida 42%. So I think the bottom table also shows a little bit about what we haven't talked about at length. We've talked about ways to bring in the 2011-2013 as an allocation basis, and to not disadvantage those states that have had recent upturns in their landings. But when I look at that, looking again at Virginia, specifically, it's a 24% decrease from the working group quota from the 2011-2013 average. So Virginia doesn't cut a break no matter what in these types of scenarios, nor in the working group updated quota. And I'd like to come back later and follow up on something different concerning the 12%, but the premise I have right now is I'm not certain why the various working groups that have formed have spent so much time, and I think it's good they have. I understand why they have, and I understand the intent, but really it's a difficult challenge no matter how you try to work out the winners and losers in all this. And in the case of Virginia, I just can't see where, if we have a long-term average, 1998-2010, of 102,000 pounds, and in fact, we continue that in recent years, even if you add in 2013, that we're headed towards a 24% reduction. And we're not alone. There are other states that are in that situation no matter what we do. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. And I'll ask the work group members to comment. But, I think it came down to, in order to account for more history, you're going to have a more substantial impact on the current fisheries. And option 3 and 4 looked at a way to incorporate historical harvest, but in order to achieve that, you're going to see substantial impacts to current fisheries. So I think, Rich, you wanted to comment, perhaps?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We certainly struggled with trying to be fair, and there is no scenario by which somebody doesn't gain something and somebody doesn't lose something. But we tried to lessen that as much as possible. I think what to concentrate on is that we're not going to these quotas. We're going to a soft tack. And that gives every state the ability to catch what they caught last year and basically, and without going to these quotas. So if we stay under that number, then we can continue on. Some states, the harvest will vary from one year to the next. So that's what we focused on, is to try to have the fishermen stay within the overall coastal quota so we don't have to go to these individual state quotas.
Thanks, Rich. You got Jim, then Roy.
Rich, those are good comments, and I'm good with the first part, because I think that's a good first step, and it gives us a little time. But getting to Rob's comment, first off, Rob, you characterized like 2011 through 13 as an uptick, and in our situation, it's not an uptick. We're not requiring harvest landings, before 2011. So, as I said earlier, we actually had higher landings that were not in the stock assessment. So, if I look at any of the options, well, it doesn't look so bad because we're looking like we're in maybe the higher percentage, the 25% reduction. But if I look at what our actual landings are based on the last 3 years and what we thought before, I'm at 65% reduction. And my concern with this is if we get to that point next year where I've got an actual landings around 50,000 pounds, but I got a quota of 12 or 13,000 pounds, I have to shut my fishery down probably early in the season. The idea of like reducing poaching and all that stuff, that's going to go through the winter. It's going to have a rampant poaching going on. Those prices in the adjacent states are going to go up. And we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot. So we really need to get something for 2016 that is going to actually work. And I have no problem taking a hit. I think most of the states understand that they're going to have a reduction. But I know you guys tried to get equity into this, but right now it's pretty far away from that. Thanks.
Okay, got Rory.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering if you or perhaps Kate could help review for me the difference in the filtering mechanisms between Section 3.1.2 out of the plan and the working group filtering mechanisms. I'm not sure that I understand what they are in relation to each other. Thank you.
So under the filtering method as it was described in the draft addendum, no state could be allocated a quota that was more than 10,000 pounds above its 2010 harvest level. The working group, after deliberation, felt that this number should be reduced to 2,000 pounds in light of the fact that there was a minimum allocation of 2,000 pounds given to some states that had less than this number, and so they thought that that would be equitable to allow the increase up to 2,000 pounds above the 2010 harvest level. And then also just to point out, when this new filtering method was applied, the initial allocation was 893,000 pounds, a little over, and then the working group used the difference between this 893,000 pound level and the TC recommended baseline of 907,000 pounds, and this difference was just under 14,000 pounds, and then this was distributed to the states that were negatively impacted by the quota distribution as a way to provide a bit of a buffer to them and bring their quota up. So the states of New Jersey, Delaware, PRFC, and North Carolina each received just over 3,000 pounds, and the state of Rhode Island was brought up to their 2010 harvest level.
Thanks, Kate. Rob, I have you, but let me give a few other people the first chance at the questions. We've got Bob, Lou, and then John and Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to thank the working group for their efforts on this program. I think they've made some good headway, and I generally support the direction they're advocating. However, I'm not sure I follow the process that leads to the Table 1 figures for the updated quota, based on what I understand to be the approach that's advocated. So if I could, I'm just going to walk through what I think are the 2 or 3, 4 or 5 steps that I think lead to that those updated quotas, and I want to find out where I might have been misled in my analysis. First of all, I mean, we're talking about a pie that needs to be sliced up. So the first question is, what size is the pie? And as I understand it, it's a 907,669 pound coast-wide quota that the working group started with. Is that not correct?
That's the 2000, they started, the allocation years was the 2011 to 2013 time period.
If I could, but that might lend itself to what percentages are applied to the coastwide quota, but if I follow the working group report, the first recommendation is to adopt a coastwide quota of 907,669 pounds and then allocate it. So maybe I'm getting this backwards, but it seems to me that the first issue is what is the recommended coastwide quota for yellow eels, and I'm led to believe the recommendation is 907,669 pounds.
So the initial starting quota was the 2010 harvest level. The allocation comes from the average years of 2011 to 2013. And from that 2010 harvest level, you're taking a 16% reduction.
I guess I'll just acknowledge I'm confused then. And I appreciate the answer, and I guess I just need to get my head around this. As I read through the report, it seems clear to me that the first recommendation was a recommendation to adopt, and I'd have to go back and find it in here, but to adopt a new coastwide quota, or to adopt a coastwide quota of just 907,000 pounds. And then what, so maybe that's my problem, because I started from there, and then I worked through the percentage allocations, which I understand are the same percentages that would be as shown on Table 5, page 19 of the addendum, draft addendum. And so I applied each of those to that coastwide quota, and then I applied the filtering mechanisms as adjusted, and I came out with, and then I found that there was actually some issues as I moved on down the line. So it struck me that I must be doing something wrong in trying to figure this out, and I would appreciate any guidance. And I know, Kate, you've answered my question twice, so I don't want to ask for a third shot. Maybe I'm just the one that's confused here. Thank you.
I'll take a shot at it, Bob. And as much as I looked at this, I still ask the same question at times. So the 2000, and Kate just checked me on this, the 2010 landings are the starting point. And then what the working group did was determine what level of reduction to the 2010 landings would get us to the 907,000. And that resulted in needing a 16% reduction. So then from that 16% reduction from 2010, the quota gets allocated based upon a state's average landings between 2011 and 2013. From that point, you apply the filters that Kate described. And when you do that, you fall about 13,000 pounds short of that 907,000. And then that's where the working group suggestion was to reallocate that to the states that have been negatively impacted from 2010 landings. So I think it's that initial part that maybe you weren't following. The 2010, you take the 2010, take the 16% off of that, and then allocate it.
I think we're saying the same thing. I think if you take 16% off 2010, you get your 907,669. No? Or no?
You actually get a little less than that, I think. 902.
902.
And then when you apply the filters, it jumps up and down a little bit.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know Rob and several of the others have pointed out how the state-by-state quotas, Delaware's a state that did not benefit under any of those. That's the problem we've had with this from the beginning, is how to allocate this fairly. And that's why I think the important thing is that we have the cap and that we stay within the cap. And then I just had a question for Jim in New York as to how come New York didn't have landings, being that the original plan required mandatory reporting and the first addendum in 2006 required mandatory reporting?
We had reporting, but the compliance with it was pretty low. When we finally rechanged the regulations in 2011, we encouraged better compliance with them. So, and we're still probably not catching them all, but we're getting them a lot more accurate.
All right, you got Dan?
Thank you. Can I assume that if the working group's recommendations are adopted, there would be transferability to cover overages between states?
Yeah, if the cap, if the triggers for the cap were trip, we went to a state-by-state quota, there would be quota transfers allowed.
Okay. Could I recommend that this group consider the black sea bass style of overage and underage reconciliation instead of allowing individual states to simply make phone calls? For example, if I have a 2,000 pound overage in the year 2017, I may have no fishery the following year, whereas if Maryland has a 2,000 pound overage, they won't even blink. In the black sea bass system, if all states combined come up a pound short, then any state that goes over doesn't have to pay an overage because the overall quota was not exceeded. And if the overall quota is exceeded, the payback is proportional to the allocations. So I think that would be a fair way to do it. Otherwise, you might be looking at a lot of scrambling and phone calls.
Thanks, Dan. I think it's a good suggestion. All right, Rob, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think the flaw in the table up there, and one that has persisted, is giving 2010 any status whatsoever as we go through these reductions. Earlier today, technical committee substantiated that it is a 1998 to 2010 years that are in the assessment, the 1998-2010 years where a reduction should start from. 2010 has done really nothing to cause anything but problems in these analyses, just because it happens to be the terminal year in the assessment. I've never understood the emphasis on 2010. If you fall back to 2009, which in my mind has as much credence, then the landings go from 978,000 to 778,000, certainly more conservative. Virginia had 119,000 pounds instead of the 78,000 pounds in 2010. I'm not pointing that out for Virginia. I'm pointing that out as an example that 2010 really is not something that should be part of our determination of quotas. I appreciate what Richie said on the soft cap, but I worry with what New York has indicated and the fact that we did have 1.2 million, 1.1 million, and 917,000 pounds coastwide from 2011 to 2013. It's certainly not inconceivable that we wouldn't go beyond 10% of the cap, which is shown up there in the table, and really all that is the starting point anyway. We haven't moved at all. That 907,000 is the 0 point. So there are a lot of little problems here. If it were possible, I think the best solution would be to follow the advice of the technical committee. Take your 12% reduction from 1998 to 2010, then get the working group to figure out how to work around that for states that have situations that other states don't. So I'm really not at all taken with the working group recommendations. I'm pleased that they tried to do all this, but I think the 2010 year causes some real problems.
Thanks, Rob. Other questions before we perhaps ask for some motions to get us going? All right, seeing none. Anyone have a motion Walter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I move that we adopt the working group recommendations as part of Amendment 4, or Addendum 4.
So just for yellow?
For yellow and for silver eels, and for yellow and for glass eels, and also the recommendations on state-specific management plans and on the conservation measures.
Thanks. So just to recap that, the motion is to adopt the working group recommendations for both yellow and glass eels and for the sustainable fisheries management plans.
Yes.
Do we have a second?
If there's a second, I can.
Richie, for second. Let's get that motion on the screen. And then we'll open up for deliberation.
I'd like to offer some.
Okay. And what I'm going to try to do is to try to implement our Robert Rules of Order with asking, 1 for, 1 against, and try to balance this conversation. All right, so you can look at that motion, Walter and Richie. That look good? Richie, you good? All right, Joe, you need me to read that? Move to adopt the working group's recommendations for yellow and glass eels and for the sustainable fishery management plans. Motion made by Walter, seconded by, I can't pronounce your last name, Walter. And seconded by Richie White. Walter, you want to make a comment to the motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I look at this kind of like a budget deal that's been worked out by an appropriations committee. There's a lot in there that individual states probably don't like, but I think the likelihood of us coming up with something that's more agreeable is almost non-existent. A lot of work went into this, and I think it's something that at least most of us can live with. And if we start, and when a budget comes to the floor of the House, everybody and their uncle has amendments that they think is going to make it better. And leadership pretty much quashes them because once you start changing it and start picking it apart, it just falls apart and you end up with nothing. And I'm afraid that if we start trying to change this or improve it or fix it, we're going to fix it to death, and we're going to be here until 6 o'clock tomorrow night, and we won't have anything. Thank you.
Thanks, Walter. Richie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Walter said it best. Having worked on this as part of the working group, we spent a lot of time went around and around and around, and I think this is the best of a difficult situation. I did want to make one point, or ask for a point of clarification, and that is during our working group, the state of Maine assured us that as part of the approval of the glass eel, that they would institute the life cycle study. And I just want to make sure that that is part of this, that it's mandated that the state of Maine begin and continue to carry out the life cycle study of eels. So, I mean, I don't know if we need to have that as part of the motion, or whether, if Maine wants to go on the record saying that that's going to take place. Then.
Pat, you like to comment on that?
My first comment is I can't let Terry Stockwell go to meetings without me. No, it's Maine's intention all along to begin a full life cycle study associated with this fishery. I think it's going to give not only the state of Maine but all states a really good indication on the health of the resource, and at the levels that are committed within the working group recommendations, we will certainly support that work, that life cycle study work. Once, if we start to whittle away at the overall quota, then I would reserve comment for that, but it puts us in a tough place to prioritize that work within existing resources. So anything less than what's on the table would be problematic.
Thanks, Pat, for clarifying that commitment with the quota that the working group is recommending. All right, we'll open up for deliberation. Bob, and then Jim and Rob. Bob, you for or against?
I'm against, and I'm against because I am, as I understand it, aware that the working group recommendation was issued subsequent to the, prior to the technical committee offering their recommendation, and there's a very stark difference, and I'm speaking now specifically with regard to glass eels, and I'd like to start with that. With regard to the glass eel recommendation from the technical committee, they're recommending a total quota, as I understand it, of 4,658 pounds. 4,658 pounds is the TC recommendation, which equates to 9.3 million eels. The working group recommendation is 9,688 pounds, which equates to 19.4 million eels. So that's a lot of eels, and a big difference between the two. And I just find myself wondering out loud, are we really prepared to sanction a Elver fishery in one state that would be harvesting 20 million eels, which is 20 times the total coast-wide quota or harvest that we're likely to be seeing with regard to yellows. So it strikes me as being a very, very high number, and one that I think can and should be reduced in accordance with the technical committee's recommendations. So I would be inclined to not support this recommendation based on the technical committee's report and recommendation. Rather, I'd be inclined to support their recommendation with regard to glass eels. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Jim?
Thanks, Chairman. If you're going to follow Robert's rules, I'm in opposition to the motion, so do you want to go for a support of the motion first?
Yes, thanks for reminding me, Jim. Thanks. Rob, are you for or against?
Against.
All right, hold on. Lewis, for or against?
Oh, I'll be for.
You're up, then.
I understand where Bob's coming from with the glass eels, and I'm not particularly happy with the glass eel quota in the working group's recommendation, because I feel like that fishery needs some stability for the long term, and I just don't see a problem with the current status quo on the glass eel fishery. Just speaking as when I used to be an early life history biologist in marine fisheries, and looking at those 20 million glass eels don't give me a lot of concern at all from the population standpoint. The natural mortality rates on those things are so incredibly high that to equate them to one yellow eel, I think is really not in the best interest of this fishery management plan. Does that mean I think we should have a wholesale opening of glass eels? No, but simply because of the potential problems that creates, not necessarily from the detriment to the stock. I also recognize the need to show some good faith effort in reducing harvest in the face of an endangered species listing. So I think, as Walter said, it's about as good as we're going to get on yellow eel. It's less than I'd like to see on glass eels. So I would speak in favor of the motion, with one final caveat, and thanks to Kate for the clarification at lunch, just to make sure everyone's clear that with the aquaculture provision, you would have to show, in order to get 200 pounds of glass eels for aquaculture operations, you would have to show that those eels are coming from an area or in a body of water that would not contribute to the overall population. And so I think that's going to be an interesting effort. And for those states that are interested in pursuing that aquaculture permit, maybe a group of us getting together to discuss how we might do that would be a big help, because I'm not exactly sure how we're going to do that. But it's going to have that approach is going to have to be approved by the technical committee. I think a priori even doing the study. So, those are my comments, Mr. Chairman. I would urge support of the motion.
Thanks, Louis. Back to Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start off by, first off, I don't disagree with you, Walter. There's probably going to be losers in this, but as probably the biggest loser on this, I'm going to have to speak in opposition to it. When I left the room in August and we tabled this till now, I think I was staring down the barrel of a 22,000-pound quota on a harvest of about 45,000 pounds. So I was trying to figure out how we're going to make that work. And one of the suggestions was do transfers or whatever. We're coming up with different ideas. So when the working group came out, I commend them for the idea of at least a cap for the first year. I think that's a big help. It gives us some breathing room. But again, at the end of that cap, I'm looking at no fishery. And again, I've said this at several meetings now. The idea of this was to reduce harvest, not eliminate fisheries. And this almost eliminates New York's bait fishery. So we're taking, again, a 65% reduction the way, if this thing comes down. So we need something else. The something else's can be looking at some of those recent landings and using a percentage surrogate of those years to maybe spread out the wealth. I think some of those numbers may work. I haven't crunched those yet. But there were winners and losers. We're the big losers. Lewis made an argument the last one. He said he was taking a 50% reduction. Well, because he won the lottery, 2010, you guys hit a really high number. So, yeah, it's 50% off of 2010, but it's probably not 50% off your average harvest. So if he hits that number again and he wants to transfer 30,000 pounds to me, I think that'll be a great solution for next year. But it's really hard for me to support this in general, and unless I know exactly what we're going to do with quota transfers, I really can't support it because I'm not going to have a fishery maybe in 2016. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim, and understand your perspective. It's something the work group tried to figure out, but absent your suggestion of looking at some surrogate of recent landings, to account for maybe underreporting, we weren't able to come up with anything. Mitch, are you in support or opposition? Support? Go ahead. Go ahead, Mitch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before getting into my main comment, I just wanted to react to Bob's concerns about a 19 million eel harvest in the state of Maine. We've been through, it was a few meetings ago that Wilson Laney testified about the extraordinary work that the power companies with support of Fish and Wildlife Service have done on the Roanoke Rapids system. They informed us that the average for the 2 first years that the ladders had been put in place, those ladders, as we may recall, had been designed to support 30,000 eels a year. These are not glass eels. These are first-year eels, fingerlings that are now pigmented, have survived the first year. They expected that ladder to deliver 30,000 eels in a year. In fact, in each of the first 2 years, the average was something more around the order of 800,000 per year. We know that glass eel mortality estimates range somewhere from the high 90s to the 99.x numbers, but even if we just assume that mortality is that the survival is 1%, and it might be much less than that, those 800,000 eels would have represented 80 million eels. 800,000 eels if we assume that even 10% of the glass eel survived, and in fact those 800,000 eels would have represented a glass eel run of 8 million. So that's just on one river. So I respect your concerns about numbers, but I guess just putting the mortality, natural mortality in perspective with the typical run on a large system, I think adds a little bit more to the picture. That being said, there's many glass eel fishermen in the room here today, and I think they'd be, livid at me if they heard me say that I think the working group's compromise is a reasonable one, because just last year, Maine imposed the first quota on the glass eel fishery that state's fishermen had ever had. And of course, that resulted in a 50% reduction from where they were the previous year. It wasn't officially a 50% reduction, but in practice, it was a 50% reduction. Now, I know the response to that, which is that the 12 and 13 level
levels were artificially high, and therefore that reduction was not as severe. So be it. They took a big hit, and none of them would want me to say that the working group's recommendation seems fair and modest, and as Tom used the exact words, balanced. But when you consider the socioeconomic factors that these folks could talk about much more effectively than me, it seems like a pretty, it does feel like a balanced view. The only other thing I wanted to say was with regard to the yellow eel fishery. I'm not sure how the vote's going to go today, and I'm not going to contribute to that vote, as we all know, but it seems to me that if there's not a positive vote on the yellow eel fishery today, it's only going to be because the state allocations of a quota that might be imposed a year or two down the road are not acceptable to a majority of the commissioners. If in fact we find ourselves going in that direction, I just would like to recommend that we could leave here today passing the working group's recommendations, establishing a main glacial quota firmly, establishing a coast-wide cap firmly, and letting the public see just how serious we are about further reductions and further conservation of eels without having to have the entire fight about what happens if the cap is reached. I think I heard one or more folks say we don't want the cap to be exceeded, and hopefully as a group, and whether our working group continues to exist as a working group or our commission as a body of the whole, we have 3 more meetings or 4 more meetings before we have to see the results of the first year where these numbers are going to matter. There's a lot of time, if in fact we can't agree today, there's a lot of time to still work out those issues while still imposing the cap today and leaving here with the comfort that we've made great progress and we've made good accomplishments, and that we can satisfy our federal partners that we're taking their concerns seriously, we can satisfy the public, we're taking their concerns seriously, and at least accommodate through a balanced approach to the technical committee's measures. The final point I'm going to make on that is Rob was asking the questions in the morning session about, he was asking Sheila, like, how did we get these reductions? And it was suggested there are management tools, really effective, workable management tools that if we establish a cap of 907,000 pounds coast-wide, we could get to that cap without having to implement state quotas, whether it be shortening seasons both at the beginning and at the end, increasing size limits even further, consistent with some of the conversation this morning. So I guess I'm supporting the working group recommendations as a whole because I respect Representative Kumiega's point about bargaining and not unraveling a deal. But it seems to me, if the deal seems like it's going to unravel, we can still establish this cap as well as the main quota today and all go home with at least some clarity for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch. Assuming that Lewis and Mitch didn't change your opinion, Rob, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't think we should let expediency, promote what we're doing here as far as decisions. I would have thought that the yellow and glass eel issues should have been separate issues that we looked at. That's typically what the board tries to do rather than lump them together. There are certainly some differences to talk about for both, not to mention the reduction scenarios. And if I get an opportunity later on, we'll see if we can maybe do that. The other idea is that I can support the cap, the soft cap. I recognize that we have another year to take care of what the quota should be. I don't think that I hear a lot of good things about the quotas except for let's just go ahead and get something done today, and that's the wrong way to do things. If you didn't listen to Jim Gilmore, the problem in New York is with the approach now, you would think that New York, based on the table that was up there from the working group, gets a 13% increase. But you're talking about New York going from 13,518 pounds average from 1998 to 2010 up to 15,220. What's being missed there is New York has a 46,000 pound average for 2011 to 2013. So there are some complications here, to say the least, that we should be able to work out. There is a year time, so I hope that maybe we split that as well. I'm not ready to recommend the quotas as the working group has proposed them, both for the 2010 situation, using that as a fulcrum in all this, and also throughout this process, I'm wondering why there's emphasis on the past. In other words, I would think the last 3 years of the eel harvest tell us something about the trends along the coast. I understand there are bait problems, that some states don't have the bait, and I know you tried to figure that all in, but Virginia does not have a pivotal position here. Virginia could be somewhere from 78,000 to 93,000 pounds, depending on what the outcome is. It's the process that I think, after several attempts to get equitable distribution of a quota, that needs some more work. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Rob. Just speaking on being involved with the allocation discussions for about a year now, I think whatever scenario you look at, there's going to be a few states that make the same arguments as we're hearing today. Not to say that we should have to go forward with this current allocation, but just recognize that if the board continues to discuss allocation, there's always going to be a few states that are going to be making the case that they're negatively impacted. So, just throw that out there. The soft cap does get us going in the right direction. The allocation is a struggle, given that all the states have very different peaks in their landings. Dennis, are you for or against? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Walter Kamiga had it right from the very beginning that we should be looking at what was brought before us and looking at it very favorably, because if we tried to undo it or change it, we will never accomplish anything. And I think that we should need to have respect for the work that was done by the subcommittee that we put in place. I think that we have to look at the people who are on the subcommittee. Terry Stockwell, who has a big oar in this water. Glass seals in particular, I can only imagine the heartburn that Terry Stockwell had when they came up with a significant reduction, probably about 1,800 pounds of glass seals, representing anywhere from $2 million to $4 million to the state economy. And we have to look at the socioeconomic problems that are presented by this. Tom O'Connell, chair, Maryland had a significant effect on their yellow eel fishery. So these people that sat down and did this hard work for us, I think their work needs to be respected, and I think that we should support the working group's work in the paper that they presented us and the motion that is before us. And I hope that we can find it in our hearts to vote for this, because this is just a political thing, and it is the art of compromise. Everyone doesn't get what they want, and I can sympathize with Mr. Gilmore from New York that probably, as often happens, he seems to be on the losing end of these kinds of things, but maybe there's reasons for that, Joe.
It was my predecessor.
Doug, you for or against?
That was meant to be lighthearted, Joe.
Pat, you for or against? Russ, for or against? All right, Doug, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one clarification. I keep hearing the term that we have this cap for 1 year, but the way I read the recommendation of the committee is that if we stay under 10%, if we stay under the cap continuously, it stays in place. Or if we don't go over more than twice, up to 10%, so it would continue to stay in place. So I think it gives states an incentive to try and keep within the cap without having to go with the state-by-state quotas which, I was hoping would help out some of the states that are being disadvantaged by going to state-by-state quotas. The other thing is, it sounds like the state's recommendation, the working group's recommendations here is that we would have quota transfers, and I think that can help some of the people some of the states that have come up short. And Jim, I'm willing to give you 1,000 of my 2,000 pounds. Maybe that's not allowed, but on this, but I'd certainly be willing to, the same way I gave you some of my black sea bass quota, if they'll allow me. The other question, and I agree, this definitely was a compromise, and I think I give the working group, who I knew had some very strong differing opinions, a lot of compliments and kudos for coming up with compromises here that I took. They kind of learned from some of our past workings with other species and tried to avoid some of those pitfalls that we got on with some other species, and I want to commend them. I also want to commend the state of Maine for agreeing to, again, lower, at least in the working group recommendation, lower their quota, which I think is heading in the right direction, even though it doesn't make the meet the technical committee's recommendations. I know Richie asked Commissioner Kelleher let me put it this way, Commissioner Kelleher said it was his intent to start the life cycle study, and I think that is good and should be tied to that 9,000 pound quota. Would you be comfortable with it being a compliance measure that you have to continue to do it as long as your quota is at that level? So if we could make that a compliance measure in the plan.
Yes.
So if we can make that a compliance measure as long as the quota is at that level.
The motion as it reads would accept the glass eel recommendations that the working group put together, and that would include the option 10 monitoring requirements with some modifications so that any state that has a commercial glass eel fishery that's above 750 pounds would have to complete the life cycle monitoring survey as it's specified in draft addendum 4.
Good, and as you can tell, I support the working group's recommendations here.
Thanks, Doug. Since I don't have anybody on the list, Bob, let me go through a couple of people that haven't spoken yet, okay? Got Pat, and then Russ.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doug covered a lot of what I was going to say, so I'm not going to bother to repeat it, but I would remind the board from Maine's perspective with our glass eel fishery, that we have done a tremendous amount of work, which we've reported to the board in the past several meetings regarding our swipe card system, all the rule and law changes that we put in place. But the one piece that I don't want to go unnoticed is the fact that we all but gave up our silver eel fishery back in the 90s in order to move forward and with the understanding at the time that we were going to maintain some semblance of a glass eel fishery. Obviously, at the time, nobody ever envisioned it becoming what it is over the last several years, what it's become over the last several years. With the silver eel changes, the last 3 remaining licenses that were grandfathered, they're all but gone based on the changes that we've made now. And there is one fishery that, even though it was classified as a weir fishery in the state of Maine, that harvest is actually done prior to the September 1 date as defined within the addendum. So we have now completely eliminated all of our silver eel fisheries in the state, which I think is also a step in the right direction as far as the sustainability of species. So So I am in favor. Frankly, I'm reluctantly in favor because I wanted to see status quo with our fishery with all the work we did. But in the spirit of compromise and trying to move forward, at this time, I'm willing to support the motion.
Thanks, Pat. Roy, did you want to speak in support or opposition?
Mr. Chairman, I had a question concerning the issue that was raised about the 750 pounds. I need some clarification, if that can be handled quickly.
Yep.
Who does that refer to? In other words, what state would have a glass eel harvest under 750 pounds other than South Carolina or Maine?
It'd be South Carolina, and then if a state came forward with a plan that the board would allow a development of a glass eel fishery, if that glass eel fishery went above 750 pounds, they would also have to do a life cycle study under the Sustainable Fishery Management Plan, or option 6, which is the stock enhancement program under the glass eel fishery. So right now it only impacts South Carolina, but there is the potential for other states to develop a glass eel fishery, and if those fisheries exceeded 750, they would have to do a life cycle study.
May I follow up? Just a comment. I think it's a poor idea to open a glass eel fishery for any state that's thinking about doing so. Contemplating one less than 750 pounds. And I say that not from a biological standpoint, but just from an enforcement standpoint. I think it opens too many doors to poaching and monitoring and enforcement, and that would concern me. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. I got Russ, and then we'll come back to Bob. Craig? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to say a few things about the working group, and as you know, and it's well documented, New Jersey was against having any type of catch cap in the beginning, and we were also against getting any kind of quota. So for me to be a part of that working group and to come back to our fishermen with a cap and a quota, it doesn't go over very well. But, I thought that was part of what we were trying to accomplish as a working group, to come up with the best options we could possibly come up with. And, through hard work, as other people have already said, we did that. And I don't think that we can sit back now and say, okay, well, let's try to change the way we came up with the allocations for all the different states. It's really not going to affect New Jersey all that much overall, but it could affect other states and make them either bounce one way or the other. And I thought the working group did a fine job trying to come up and take care of everybody in every state as best they could with those recommendations. And I want to thank everybody that was a part of that. And the best part about that was having that face-to-face, because without that, I don't think we would have even got this done. And it hasn't been, we just came up with some new numbers here to do this. We've been talking about this quota and cap system since a year and a half, 2 years now, and I don't think it's going to get any better. And I appreciate Walter, and his viewpoint on making sure that we do this. This is it. I mean, we're not going to go through this again. I don't want to be a part of a working group to come up with another set of numbers and do this again. That's 2 already that we've done. So I'm just hoping that we can move this forward. I think everybody did a great job, and I hope that's the way it works. Thank you.
Thanks, Russ. Before I come back to people that have already spoken, I want to get people that haven't. I have Craig and Adam. Craig, you for or against?
Not yet reached a decision. Had a question.
Go ahead, Craig.
When I look at the numbers, one of the things that kind of jumps out at me is that if we adopt a set of guidelines that's so far away from what the most recent norm has been, what's the message? Now, I think from a standpoint of conservation, there's certainly a message to that. But in terms of, and I look at the state of Maine, in terms of the effort that they've made in the last couple of years to get a handle on what I think we've all understood to be a pretty significant illegal harvest in many cases, and work very hard to get people licensed, regulated, and under the control of an agency. What's the message now? Is the message now going to be, we went along with this in an effort to try and have some sustainability of what we thought the numbers would be, and now it's far less. I think most people, I would hope, would be honorable and live within the framework of the rules that we have, but it's such a reduction that I wonder whether we're going to have the impact, the conservation impact that we're hoping for, or is that going to go the other way? Whatever savings we've assumed in the management is not actually going to be the fact that there'll be a lot of illegal activity. But I'm not in the law enforcement end, so I don't know, where the numbers are. I know when we talk about licensing, if we have a doubling of a license number, there are some statistics that clearly state that you'll have a 40% reduction in the amount of licenses purchased. So you have illegal fishing with unlicensed fishermen. So those kind of assumptions are out there. I don't know whether we take that into account when we make these adjustments here.
Thanks, Greg. Adam, you for or against?
I'm against.
Go ahead.
I've listened very carefully to the comments here, and my next comment comes with great consideration of the work that was done by the working group. But I have to preface it by saying that with our earlier comments about not being able to put a tangible benefit on what a significant cut from recent landings would mean, I can't leave here looking at the people in the audience, a number of public comment, and people in the home state saying this is how we're going to go forward with that. And to that end, I would like to move to amend the motion as it currently is with a modification to the yellow eel. I would move that we use the soft cap with a number of 978,004 pounds. We would use trigger number 2 if we exceed it in 2 years. And the allocation we would fall back on was the allocation schedule as set forth in option 2A in the document.
All right, we'll get that typed up on the screen. We have second. Emerson seconds the motion. So we have move to amend to use soft cap with 978,000. Hold on a second. No. Just give us a second to get the motion up on the screen. Hey, Adam, just for clarification, option 2A as described in the addendum versus the work group's recommendations?
Yes, the work group recommendation for allocations were based on a number around 907,000. This is a Part 2A is 980-something thousand and provides the breakdown of the percentage and the state-by-state poundages there as well.
Adam, just to clarify, the 2010 landings here, which would be the soft cap of 978,004 pounds, if this was tripped after 2 consecutive years of exceeding this quota, then we would revert to option 2A, which specifies the quota is actually 986,000 pounds.
That was the closest I could come to something, recognizing that the working group wasn't an exact match for the numbers also. They were off by a couple thousand pounds, and that was the closest I could come to something that I thought matched the number that we had.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I'm just asking for clarification on that. So when we get that motion on the screen, let's take a look at it and see if we captured that thought. All right, ready, Joe? Move to amend to use soft cap of 978,004 pounds and trigger number 2 from the working group recommendations. If cap is exceeded in 2 years, then allocation would be as specified as option 2A from draft addendum 4. Motion by Mr. Nowalski and seconded by Mr. Hashbrook. That look good, Adam?
Yes, thank you.
All right, we got deliberation on the motion. Richie, do you have?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Speaking in opposition, And I would just remind the board that the task to the working group was to come up with an option that was 907,000 pounds, and the majority of the board voted for that. So the majority of the board supported 907,000 pounds at the last meeting, and this clearly exceeds that by a substantial amount. And I just think that the whole working group plan starts to fall apart when we get down this road, because then there'll be another amendment, another change, and it will fall apart. So, strongly oppose.
Thanks, Richie. Other commenters? Jim?
It kind of goes to both motions. I was going to ask it before this was made, but say we get to the end of either the year or the 2 years with either one of these motions, and then in past when we've done allocation schemes, there was an ability to correct it based upon new data. And there was two ways to do that. There was either to submit data that would just be considered at the board, and then there would be a reallocation based upon that, or there would have to go through a full addendum process. So if we get to the point where we go to a quota, and that, all right, my situation, I'm very clearly going to have good data that's going to say I need to change my allegation. How are we going to go about doing that? Is that going to have to be through a full addendum process, or is that something that could be handled more, I mean, in a shorter, maybe individual board discussion? Thank you.
Yeah, so Jim, I guess if I understood you correctly, and I guess maybe something for the board to think about is, if we go forward with an allocation scheme, is there a provision which the state can come forward with documentation of updated numbers that could result in a potential allocation change? And if so, that would have to be another addendum or not. All right, we'll give that some thought, all right? Let's see here. Got Rob, you for or against?
I'm against. It's an improvement in some cases. If you're strictly looking for improvements, for Virginia, it improves things. Instead of a 24% reduction or 23% reduction, it's 14%. New York is almost a 50% reduction to Signal 2. States there, the problem, I agree. You've got the 907,000 as the standard, 907,669, which the working group came up with. I certainly disagree with some of the data they used. I'm sorry about that, but 2010 was a poor choice to put into any of these analyses, so I can't support this one either.
Thanks, Rob. We got Lewis. You for or against?
I'm against.
Hold on a second. Mitch, you for or against? Go ahead, Lewis.
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mitch, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Adam for making that motion. I think that motion shows a lot of sensitivity to commercial fishermen in the eel industry who are among some of the least wealthy, least prolific fishery participants in what's really one of the smallest fisheries managed by this commission. I'm very mindful of Richie's point that if we start altering the working group recommendations, it might be a road that we go down that we can't get out from under. I know everyone's mindful of that. Nonetheless, if I believe this is substantively a better approach, I think I have to speak for it, so I'm speaking for it. The number of 978, we obviously it's 7, 8, or 9% higher than what the working group is recommending. I think from some of my questions this morning, I made clear that my position is that this fishery, and there's a lot of evidence to this effect, but that the fishery is not a substantial cause of declines in eel populations. I understand that being the case, we still have to do things to restrain this fishery in order to satisfy public sentiment and sentiment from some of our federal partners. But the key is to remember that when you don't look at the landings from 98 to 2010, but look at the landings for as far as we've been measuring them significantly. That takes us back to like the 60s, 70s, and 80s. This is a fishery that existed in the range of 2 to 3 million pounds a year for much of that time. The overwhelming message that I've received from the various attempts at stock assessment, whether it be in the U.S. or Canada, whether it be the federal agencies or ASMFC, is that, and it was our own, one of our technical committee chairmen, I think also Brad Chase, who made very clear that the DBSRA model reflects the fact that when catches are low for a long period of time, we can assume that populations are going to be higher in the ensuing years. And when catches are very high for quite a few years in a row, we can assume that that populations are going to be low in the ensuing years. It's not really rocket science. That's what DBSRA tells us, that we had a series of fishing up and fishing down events, and the fact remains, colleagues, that we're now in the midst of a 15-year trend where we've really been at the low end of our historical catches. Again, you know, in 13 years, I think we've never gone above 1.2 million pounds. You have to go back 10, 20 years earlier before we were in those kind of numbers. So locking in a coastwide cap at 978 versus 907,000, it's a lot of window dressing, but substantively it's not really changing things. Finally, I do think that no matter how the board votes on this, relying on only trigger 2 is far superior than the 2 triggers because the year 2014, the year that we're currently in, I can almost assure my colleagues on this commission that the total harvest coastwide is not even going to exceed 600,000. Last year, 700,000. We're not going to reach those numbers the way this season is going. It has nothing to do with catch. It has nothing to do with stocks. It's purely economics. Pure and simple. The price of eel is right now at a long-range low. Effort is way down. We've heard anecdotal evidence from state after state about people that haven't been fishing. If we have a 400 or a 500,000 harvest this year, then next year we have a 999,000 harvest. That means our 2-year average was something like 600, 700,000, well within the range we want to be. Yet, the way the working group recommendations are read, we would have to immediately implement a quota after 2015 if those harvests went up to the 990,000, without taking into account that just 1 year earlier we were 400,000. So I think that basing the trigger on a 2-year analysis as opposed to 1 is a significant improvement. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch. You got Lewis?
Yeah, I think the 907,000 was the direction from the board at the last meeting. And we're heading in a direction to go home with nothing again. Tempted to substitute a moratorium. Maybe that would get people moving a little quicker. But to go now to something substantially above at least the original technical committee recommendation, that's substantially higher than the most recent technical committee recommendation, I believe, which was another 16% below the 907, I think. So you're going to lose a lot of votes just because of that it's so contrary to the technical committee's position. But, you know, I didn't understand, I didn't get the trigger situation quite like Mitch did, that you would have to exceed by 10% in a year and then exceed again in a year, and it wouldn't average out. So if that is the way that it would work, that's a different question. I'll keep clicking my pen. Sorry, Tony. But I would just, I think we've got to at least stick with the original technical committee guidance on the 907, or else we're making a big mistake.
Thanks, Lewis. Got John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to say that the cap that Adam suggested there was actually the first soft cap that the working group discussed, and I was very much in favor of that. But the great thing about working with the working group was we got the full range of opinions there, and what kept coming through clearly was how many people could not support a cap that was not based on the technical committee recommendation. So that's why we moved to the using the technical committee recommendation with the 10% buffer on that, which is actually higher than the 978. I was also in favor of going for the 2 years, but through the process of compromise we went through, we came up with that 1-year cap. And it's not perfect. I know nobody is thrilled with what we came up with, but I think given the circumstances, it does pretty much what you want it to do with your amended motion, except for the 1-year trigger there. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I don't have anybody else on my list here. So let's take a 30-second caucus and vote on.
Could I request a roll call vote?
Sure. Yeah, Bill?
Are you going to let the public comment on this, or what?
I'm not, I mean, after this, we'll consider that, but not right now. A roll call vote was requested, so Kate's going to go through that.
Maine?
No.
New Hampshire?
No.
Massachusetts?
No.
Rhode Island?
No.
Connecticut? New York?
Yes.
Connecticut?
Yes.
New York?
Yes.
New Jersey?
Yes.
Pennsylvania?
No.
Delaware?
This is the amendment, right?
This is the amended motion.
No.
Maryland?
No.
DC? Potomac River Fisheries Commission?
No.
Virginia?
No.
North Carolina?
No.
South Carolina?
No.
Georgia?
No.
Florida?
No.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
No.
National Marine Fisheries Service?
No.
Motion fails, 13 opposed, 3 in favor. So we're back to the initial motion, and let's see here. I had Emerson, who hadn't spoken yet. Emerson, would you like to comment? I'm sorry, just correcting, 15 opposed, 3 in favor. Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I have to speak against the motion. I appreciate all the hard work that the working group did on this, but I can't go back to New York with a 50% or greater than a 50% cut from what our recent harvest has been. And also in terms of the what the total quota may be. There isn't anything magical really about 907,000 pounds or 978,000 pounds or some other number that's similar to those. We heard from the technical committee earlier that the reduction was based on just taking into account or making up for the variance in the annual landing. So there's nothing magical about that quota in terms of what it's going to do for the resource. Thank you.
Thanks, Emerson. I had Richie, who had not spoken on the initial motion. Actually, you did. I'm sorry. Go back to Bob for second time around.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question regarding what's embodied in this motion with regard to aquaculture. As I understand it, it includes a recommendation to move forward with option 8, aquaculture permitting, as well the sustainable fishery management plans, which have an aquaculture plan provision or option. And when I read those two, I'm not sure they're saying the same thing. So I'm wondering what we are actually, or what this motion would actually allow for with regard to glacial fisheries for aquaculture purposes. Option 8 is very broad. It simply says that under this option, any harvest of glass eels for commercial aquaculture purposes must be done under an aquaculture permit. it doesn't say anything along the lines of, or reference, I should say, domestic aquaculture facilities. So it seems to me it could be as open-ended as allowing for the glass eel fishery that currently exists in Maine, which, as I understand it, ultimately is for commercial aquaculture purposes, albeit overseas. So I'm just concerned about the open-ended nature of option 8, what it actually allows for, since it just simply broadly allows, since it states in the addendum that an aquaculture permit can be granted for commercial aquaculture purposes with really no other strings attached. And I would just note that in the addendum, it's noted that it is not possible at this time to propagate American eels in captivity, and as such, that option is not recommended by the TC. Notwithstanding that TC comment, I'm really mostly interested in what this option would allow a state to do, given its open-ended nature. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to let Kate answer that.
As to the option 8, the aquaculture permitting, I can speak for the PDT that the intention there was for domestic aquaculture purposes. It was not targeting, say, a Maine glass eel fisherman that was selling to a dealer for then shipment overseas for aquaculture purposes. It was specifically for harvesting, where that harvest is going directly to an aquaculture facility domestically. That was the intention of the PDT, and the board can certainly provide that clarification if they would like to include that. With the aquaculture plan, this is allowing 200 pounds to be harvested, and there are a number of specifications that states would have to submit in order to have a plan approved by the technical committee or recommend approval by the technical committee to the board before the plan could be implemented.
Just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you. So thank you, Kate, for that. And I would say, therefore, in my view, option 8 should be struck from this motion. It seems to me the aquaculture plan provision under the sustainable fishery management plans covers the issue with more specificity, more clarity, and with the sideboards necessary, I think, to move forward appropriately. I'm just concerned about, and I appreciate the explanation, but it's not in the addendum. It's really sort of an anecdotal comment as to what was intended. And unless we can get something on the record that clarifies or corrects that, my suggestion is we strike option 8 from this motion. Thank you.
Well, let's see if others comment on that, and if need be, we can come back to that, Bob. See here. So we got Jim. Did you want to? It's been a long time since you raised your hand, I know. All right. And then I had Richie, and then Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question. If you believe, as I believe, that we probably had enough discussion on this matter, would you now think that it would be time to bring this to a vote?
I think we're getting there. I don't have anybody else on my list. We got Marty. Go ahead, Marty.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to be a good listener here today. I'd like to speak in favor of the motion, and before I do that, I'd like to reiterate what others have said and thank the work group for their hard efforts on the plan. I would like to speak in favor of the motion, even though, with regard to yellow eels, if the trigger is fired, there could be significant impacts to PRFC. And part of the reason why I don't have misgivings about that is I don't necessarily like the trends that I'm seeing in the river. May not apply to other jurisdictions, but PRFC's long-term landings are closer to 250,000 pounds. And we've had highs in excess of 600,000 pounds in the river. We're nowhere near that in recent years. In fact, we're near all-time lows. And the time frame from 98 to 2010 is front-end loaded, so the impacts that are contributing to the large negative delta if the trigger fires is because of the harvest in the years 98 through, say, 2001. But in recent years, we're not seeing anywhere near that. And it certainly wouldn't be at the core of our mission statement to be an adherence of that, to conserve and enhance our resource. to take a less, I'd be okay dealing with that trigger if that came to fruition. I just don't like what we're seeing in the river with yellow eels. I do agree with Bob that I don't think the plan goes far enough with glass eels, and I do agree with Rob. It's unfortunate that the plans are bundled together, but in the effort to have some progress, any progress, I would just encourage the board to consider this and let's move this forward. Let's have some progress forward. Since I came here and relieved my predecessor, A.C. Carpenter, I've heard nothing but feedback from the staff that this animal needs some relief at all life stages. And we have the ESA listing in progress. The signals are pretty clear. There is some uncertainty, but it's less than optimum for sure. And I'd like to see some progress, any progress, and I'd speak in favor of the motion. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. I got Rick Belvance, and then I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a brief opportunity for the public, and then we'll come back to the board, all right? So, Rick, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In general, I do support the motion. Just one little part of it that kind of rubs me a little bit is the exemption for the reporting requirements for states harvesting less than 750 pounds. I guess I feel like we're moving in a great direction with swipe card reporting systems and modern technology that can be used inexpensively to create daily trip reporting, timely data collection, and I see examples like this, and it just makes me think we're going down the wrong road. We're trying to get better data, not less data, and that's just the only part. I just want to make that as a comment more than anything. So maybe as these tools develop, those states will voluntarily jump onto them, but putting something like that in there just seems counterproductive in my mind. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Just before we go to the public, Kate, in regard to your question, Bob, about option 8, her suggestion would be to either add domestic to option 8 or strike option 8. So we can come back to that perhaps after listening to the public. How many people, those that are in the public audience, how many here would like to speak? If you could raise your hands. Looks like there's three, 4 people. We're going to provide a brief opportunity for public comment. We've already taken this plan out to public comment. So I'd ask that you keep your comments to less than 2 minutes. And if there's a representative from your industry that can speak on behalf of a couple or more of you, that would be great. So if you could show your hands again. We'll go from left to right. You come up to the microphone and introduce your name, and let's try to keep it at 2 minutes if you can. Come on up.
Yeah, thanks. Arnold Leo. I'm representative of the fishing industry of the town of East Hampton, Long Island, New York. And my concern with the motion that's up before you is that, as it points out in the draft addendum itself, in discussing option 8, it's going to create a derby fishery, which of course tends to glut the market, drive the price down, and result in reaching the end of the quota early, thereby very much being inequitable for the fisheries that depend on fishing later in the season. So it seems to me an extremely unwise fishery management approach, and I would oppose it. Thank you.
Thanks for your brief and pointed comment. Thanks. If you can come up, help me go left to right. You're right to left, I guess. So come on up to the microphone. If you guys want to get in a line, that would be great. You can. That will facilitate a little bit as well. So if you guys want to form a line behind the public mic, state your name for the record, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing public comment. My name is Jeffrey Pierce. I represent the Maine Alva Fishermen's Association. We're uncomfortable with this. We've gone through a lot of cuts. In the late 90s, we did a 75% gear reduction in this fishery. In the early 2000s, we did a 70% license reduction in this fishery. Last year, we addressed a very difficult subject of poaching, and we worked with the Commissioner Kelleher and you guys for 40% reduction. It seems to us no good deeds going unpunished. We feel we're being punished with an 18% reduction. Again, there's 500 guys in this fishery that have less than 3 pounds. You're going to take 18% from them? It just doesn't seem right. I think Maine should stay status quo for the next 3 years to give some economic stability for our buyers and our industry. We have a potential client industry coming to Maine for a grow-out facility. If we keep getting cut, why would they come? We've already seen a reduction in half in our price in the last 2 years. We look at the low quota numbers from the early 2000s, that's because there was no price. Nobody fished. There was no effort. We just feel we're being punished again. Thank you.
Thank you. Others that want to come up, please come to the microphone, state your name for the record, please. Thank you.
My name is Julie Keene. I'm from Maine. I've been an Alva fisherman for 22 years. Last year I lost 2/3 of my income with the cuts, and I'm very distressed by all this. We were put on a quota system, and our commissioner wisely held back 500 pounds. So that's 500 pounds that nobody could catch. There were people that were very bad, and they lost their licenses to fish last year. They get them back this year. Their quota was capped back. We weren't allowed to have that. We also had people in the industry that just started fishing that didn't know what they were doing, so they didn't catch their quota either. So we're being given a quota based on what we caught last year, and we have people coming back with licenses that they lost last year that now we've got to share that with, and I just don't know how many more cuts we can endure. There's no other work where I live at all, except for digging clams and picking periwinkles. And I'm too old to go do that anymore, and I'm just really scared, and I care deeply about the eels in the future. I'm a conservationist at heart. I fight with our commissioner all the time about other things that I would like to see left alone, but I support all the work that's gone into this. I hope we have a future in all our states for our eels. I have seen biblical runs of eels in the last 3 years where I couldn't even believe it, and I wish to God I'd had a camera. I would encourage somebody somehow to find some money to send a federal observer. I know that money's tight everywhere, but if we had a federal observer and we could say, please come to the river, come, because when they run like that, they run for, maybe 3 or 4 days. And people would be shocked if they could just see what we're seeing.
If you could just wrap up your comment, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Before, was there one other person that wanted to speak? If you want to come up to the microphone and state your name for the record, please. Thank you.
My name is Patricia Bryant. I am from Noblesboro, Maine. I have been a glass eel fisherman since 1978. I fished for approximately 25 years and managed as general manager for W.R. Livingston Eel Farm for a couple of years in the mid-90s. This fishing industry has been my entire life. I have been for the last several years, since 1998, I've been an independent buyer, exporter, as well as fisherman. I do agree. Mr. Kelleher did a great job. Commissioner Kelleher did a really good job last year volunteering our quota. We kept that. We could not fish our quota simply because we weren't allowed to fish our quota, because the people who held licenses that had their licenses suspended, like Julie was saying, we never got credit for that, and we couldn't fish those eels. So that's why the fishery was down to the number that it is. Unfortunately, if we do have to take this particular digger again, and I didn't understand the part about wanting to keep this, where you said that this is, you're afraid that poaching would be, you kept the number low because you were afraid this would increase the poaching. Well, if the numbers by being reduced is going to increase the poaching, then why are we reducing numbers? Because then you're just going to increase the poaching. This is going to make just a tremendous hardship on not only the fishermen, but on the exporters and the entire industry as a whole, and it's really, seriously not necessary. We've done a good job. We can keep it below the quota. I don't see any reason. Over the years, I've seen ups and downs, and 10,000-pound quota before we had to report was not a big deal. You're using reported landings from 2000 or from 1990 to 2010, and I think it's only about 4 of those years was mandatory reporting. So a lot of people didn't report because it wasn't mandatory, so I don't think it's even right to use those particular numbers. I appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks all of you who came from the public to listen to our deliberation today. We're going to bring it back to the board deliberation on the motion. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move to amend by striking option 8 from the main motion. And if I get a second, I'd just like to add a clarifying comment. Thank you.
Got a second by Dan McLaren. Move to amend by striking option 8 from the main motion. Motion by Mr. Ballou and seconded by Mr. McLaren. Come back to you, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I just want to emphasize for the board's edification that I do think aquaculture initiatives might be worthy of pursuit. I just think that they're better addressed under the aquaculture plan provisions of under the sustainable fishery management plans, which is already part of the main motion. So this is just a way of clarifying what we mean by aquaculture with regard to glass eels. Thank you.
Thanks, Walt. Did you support or oppose?
I was going to ask if you, I'm willing to accept it as a friendly, as is Mr. White. If you want to ask for objections from the board, if there are none, we can just accept it.
Since we have the motion on the table, let's finish the deliberation, and if there's no objection, we can handle this quickly. Anybody else that wants to comment on the amendment? All right, seeing none. See a roll call votes being requested. Is there any objection to the motion before we do a roll call vote? All right, seeing none, motion carries. Okay. All right. All right, so this motion carries. It becomes part of the main motion. We've had quite a bit of a deliberation on the main motion. Not seeing any hands raised. Let's take a 30-second call. Rob?
Yeah, we've had some conversation here at the table, and although it is disappointing that none of the tables, I went back through again just to make sure, none of the tables that are in our document or that the working group looked at used the 1998 to 2010 baseline for reductions. Although that's disappointing, although it's disappointing that 2010 has had such a prominence, I think at the same time, after listening to comments around the board, that this is a starting point for everyone. I don't think we should say this is progress. I think we should say this is setting a standard, and then we're going to monitor the standard. And I hadn't commented on the glass eel issue, but a couple of things, practical things that stick with me. I don't think we've decided yet or had the information as to natural mortality versus fishing mortality with glass eels. I brought this up a year and a half ago. Used to correspond with Dr. Brian Jessup in Canada about this issue, and I know when I brought it up that Mitch Fagenbaum had mentioned it's system specific. I heard some comments today that probably with that type of a system we're looking at through Maine, that maybe it's part of the natural mortality. But I think that's an issue that at some point needs to be looked at. It's a tough issue to look at. I recognize that. On a practical standpoint about glass eels, although I know the technical committee recommendation varies widely from what the working group did. I do understand the efforts Maine has made. I also understand, just listening to New Hampshire, which probably a year ago was not thinking the same way about what was going on with poaching and law enforcement and everything else, that there certainly have to have been some really marked improvements, and I think that's been recognized several times. So I do think we're setting standards for both the glass eel quota and as well as for the cap, the soft cap for yellow eel, and we'll just have to see how those standards stand for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate that. All right, let's take a 30-second caucus, and we'll do a roll call vote. All right. You need me to read it? All right. Move to adopt the working group's recommendations for yellow and glass eels and for the sustainable fisheries management plans, excluding option 8 for glass eels. Going to take a roll call vote. Kate?
Maine?
Yes.
New Hampshire?
Yes.
Massachusetts?
Yes.
Rhode Island?
Yes.
Connecticut?
Yes.
New York?
No.
New Jersey?
Yes.
Pennsylvania?
Yes.
Delaware?
Yes.
Maryland?
Yes.
DC? Potomac River Fisheries Commission?
Yes.
Virginia?
Yes.
North Carolina?
Yes.
South Carolina?
Yes.
Georgia?
Yes.
Florida?
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? No. National Marine Fisheries Service?
No. Motion carries 15-4-3 opposed. Just give us 1 second to figure out the next step on this addendum.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to suggest that one step we need to take would be to handle the quota transfer issues, which will be near and dear to New York's heart now that we, I would have a motion if you're ready for that, unless you want to do something sooner.
In regards to yellow eel quota transfers, included, just checking the key, but including in the work group's recommendations was to allow quota transfers, so the last motion approved the transfers provision. I think the next step is to look at compliance requirements with submitting plans. So I'm going to ask Kate to go through with that, go over that, please.
Correct. Just so the board is aware, as specified under Addendum 3, January 1, 2015, the dealer and harvester reportings will go into effect. The working group recommendations specify that at the The states and jurisdictions will be required to approve the regulations for the implementation of any quota management should it need to be implemented by March 2016. So in order to meet that timeline, states will need to submit for the annual meeting next year in Florida their implementation plans to meet those regulations.
And Kate, is there anything in regards to the glass seal fishery, given that Maine's quota will change from 2014? Do they have to submit a plan, or?
If we could likely have an update from Maine at the February meeting, or just submit the regulations as you'll be working on them, probably likely at that time, to meet the requirements, that would be helpful. Thank you.
So is everyone clear that if, moving forward, states need to begin developing some rulemaking so that if a trigger is tripped related to the yellow eel coastal cap, that we'll be in a position to implement the state-by-state quota allocation by March 2016. So you need to begin, when you go back, begin developing your rulemaking to come before the October 2015 annual meeting for approval. All right. Okay. Walter?
Yeah, I had a question based on the stock enhancement programs, which is option 6 under glass eel harvest. Is that under the state-specific, could that be applied to the yellow eel fishery under the state-specific, where is it? State-specific sustainable fishing plans?
So Walter, I missed the first part. Are you asking whether or not states have the ability to submit a plan?
If stock enhancement programs could be applied to the state, to the yellow eel fishery as well as the glass eel fishery.
That's not allowed under that option for glass eels, but under the Sustainable Fisheries Management Plans, they could submit a plan related to yellow eels. Yeah. Joe? All right, if those in the audience could just try to keep it quiet back there so our recorder can hear the conversation, that'd be great. What we need to do is approve draft addendum 4 as modified today. Bill?
Yes, I'll make the motion to approve it as modified today. I do have a question. Do you want us to get a second on that one first?
Yeah, and Kate, just remind me, what we need is as modified. Can you turn your mic off, Bill? As modified today and at our August meeting, because it pertained to silver eels. So we'll get that up on the screen and make sure you're comfortable with it. Do we have a second to that motion? Pat from Maine. So we have a motion, move to approve draft addendum 4 as modified today and in August 2014. Bob?
Just a couple of points. Since this is a final action by this board, it's a roll call vote is required, and any meeting-specific proxies are not eligible to vote on this motion.
Bill?
If I could just return to the compliance thing one time, I did not understand. You said 2016, so does that mean that we're in 2014, right? Okay, does that mean that the 2015 year will be status quo or the new rules?
So for yellow eels, the 2015 season will be under the soft cap. But knowing that there's a trigger with the 10%, that if we exceed the 10%, if we exceed the coastal cap by 10%, we are going to implement a state-by-state quota for the 2016 season. To prepare for that possibility, states need to develop their rulemaking to be allowed to implement a state-by-state quota in 2016 if that trigger is tripped.
How about the glass eel?
for glass seals for 2015, their quota will be reduced to the working group recommendation. Pat did for me. All right, we need a roll call vote. Since we've had not unanimous support, let's do the roll call vote on the addendum.
Maine?
Yes.
New Hampshire?
Yes.
Massachusetts?
Yes.
Rhode Island?
Yes.
Connecticut?
Yes.
New York?
No, NULL.
New Jersey?
Yes.
Pennsylvania?
Yes.
Delaware?
Yes.
Maryland?
Yes.
DC? PRFC?
Yes.
Virginia?
Yes.
North Carolina?
Yes.
South Carolina?
Yes.
Georgia?
Yes.
Florida?
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? Yes. National Marine Fisheries Service?
Yes. Okay, motion carries 17 for, none against, and 1 no vote. All right, well, thanks everybody for that. Hey, Rob or Marty, one of you guys have your mic on. I think it's Rob. Thanks. All right, we have one other item on other business that was brought before us by the public in regards to turbine mortality. I asked Kate just to provide kind of an overview of how the commission is handling turbine mortality issues, and perhaps we can provide additional update at our next meeting. So, Kate, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to refer the board members back to Addendum 3, which does have a section for habitat recommendations. In that, it is included that the technical committee should work with the appropriate ASMFC committees to develop materials to support states interested in making recommendations to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for upstream and downstream passage provisions for American eel in the hydropower licensing and relicensing process. Additionally, our FERC working group, our Fish Passage working group, and our Habitat Committee all do at some point address some of these issues, and I can have our technical committee work with these organizations, and we can provide an update on what progress and what has been made, what recommendations can come from this group at the next board meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions for Kate, Bill?
Yeah, I think that's fine, and I think it is an important part of this whole thing. But do we have any expectation that we'll get anywhere with this, and what will they, whoever they are, regulatory, whatever, what they will be willing to do about it? I mean, I know we are all for doing something, and we'll press through letters or meetings or whatever, but do we have any expectation that we'll get something out of this? And I would hope we would, but I don't know.
That's a really good question, Bill. If we're going to invest the time to try to influence some of these policy changes, we also need to evaluate how successful or not successful we are. And if we're not being successful, we got to think about different strategies to address this issue. So, I think it'd be good as our commissions team, as our state teams begin to address these issues, to try to figure out a way how we can, evaluate how successful we are in advocating these issues and provide that to the board periodically so we can determine if we need to change course or not. Pat?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the issue of turbine mortality is one of the most serious issues that the species faces. I think the Habitat Committee and the Fish Passage Working Group can play a strong role here, but this really boils down to state-by-state actions when we're dealing with FERC relicensing. Turbine mortality has been one of the most difficult issues for us to deal with per license and per hydropower facility. It is, each facility is very, very unique. Eels travel through each facility at different at different water heights, and depending on if it's a bottom-fed turbine or depending on how the tail races are configured, they become incredibly challenging. So I think the more we can do at the Commission to encourage stronger requirements as these licenses are renewed, and the more we do from a state perspective, state-by-state perspective, it'll benefit the species in a whole in the long run. So.
Thanks, Pat. Tom?
When I first got on the commission in 1990, Al Getz from Maryland grabbed the hold and he says, we have to start a habitat committee. Because basically what we were doing is regulating fishermen, cutting back recreational and commercial fishermen, and we weren't dealing with some of the real problems with the fisheries. Example, striped bass is a power plant down in the Delaware Bay that's been killing enough eggs and embryos to produce 50,000 striped bass a year, according to DEP. Except when we have to make a reduction on striped bass fishermen, we never make a reduction on the power plant, so you have to reduce your kill by 25%. And that happens with all the plants that have water intakes and everything else. This is the most important issue. We can only manage fishermen, and they're taking the full brunt of this. A lot of these fisheries are in decline because of sewer plants, power plants, and other uses of the marine resource water. So I support this 100%, and we should make this not just on eels, but every other species that we're dealing with, whether it's winter flounder up in Jamaica Bay because of the sewer plants discharging and affecting their sex, or other species. So, you know, we should do this for every species and make sure they basically are handled under the new permit restrictions.
Thanks, Tom. Any other comments on the turbine mortality issue? Mitch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I want to echo the sentiments of the previous speakers. I just would also like to point out to my fellow commissioners that, you know, you just voted for option 6 in the glass eel part of the addendum, which actually allows for quota allowances for habitat restoration. I want to commend the working group for embracing that option, because we've all heard it said we can't really manage the habitat issues, we can only manage the fisheries. But here's a case where we're using our management capacity or management potential to the fullest of its capacity by giving our legislatures an additional tool, or at least an additional incentive to push the habitat issues to the maximum, because now there's an actual reward or potential reward at the end of the process. So again, I thank the working group for all their work, but on this particular issue, I commend them again for embracing this recommendation.
Thanks, Mitch. So going forward, I'll work with Kate to try to find opportunities to bring updates and assess how we're doing on those issues within the states. Any other business to come before the board today? Well, just in closing, I just want to thank Kate and Sheila and Marty and Joe. This has not been, draft addendum 4 has been a long process, and I know everyone's not leaving here today completely happy. Working group, I commend them for the amount of work they did, and if you look at it as a whole, I think, as Rob said, we've set a standard for going forward for glass eels and yellow eels. Yes, we didn't satisfy the technical committee recommendation, but I think we found that right balance between conservation needs and economic needs. And I don't think we should look at today as an endpoint. We still have a couple states that have some challenges with New York, and we got to try to find ways where we can perhaps address those issues going forward. So just want to thank all of you, and meeting adjourned. Thanks.
Before everyone runs out, since the working group did their job so well, you